When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, we were at a very dark place in our country's history. The economy cratered and then crashed into what would be the Great Depression that would last a decade. Farms and factories failed, soup kitchens replaced paychecks, and at the same time there was in Italy and Germany this fascist movement that was taking place that would soon plunge the world into an unprecedented worldwide war. It was the hopefulness of the Roaring Twenties had been replaced by fear. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt labeled that as really the enemy in his inauguration address. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Almost 2,000 years before that speech was made, Jesus addressed his disciples and said, "Do not be afraid, little flock," or "Fear not, little flock," as we used to sing. "For your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom." We have to decide whether we are going to give in to fear or whether we're going to act in faith. We're going to have to decide whether we really believe that the battle belongs to the Lord, as we just sang a moment ago. We've been looking at Mission Impossible, or Mission Possible, depending on how you interpret the splash screen there. These commands that God has given us that on the surface seem to be very difficult, if not impossible, but which God makes possible through His Spirit that dwells within us. We started with "Be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect." And we saw how that is calling us to the perfect love that God has, that we don't just love our own, we just don't just love our people, we love everybody with an unconditional love. And then we moved on to forgive your brother and sister from the heart, which sometimes sounds like an impossible command. And we talked about some of the things, that Jesus says if you don't forgive your brother or sister, then you won't be forgiven by God. That's kind of a motivation. We talked a little bit about that. And today we're talking about do not be afraid. Someone has estimated that that's the most repeated command in all the Bible. One count I saw said that is repeated 200 times. I didn't count them up myself, but I actually, after the sermon was written, I ran across somebody posted something on Facebook that said there are 365 times in the Bible that says do not be afraid, one for every day of the year. Well, it doesn't really, can't be sure how many times, but it's repeated over and over again, very often during times when people are at a crossroads and have to make a decision whether they're going to trust God or not. Like in Genesis 15, Abraham has been following God for some time now. All of these promises that God made all revolve around the promise that He's going to have many descendants. And those descendants are going to become a great nation. And they're going to be given a great land. And through them all nations will be blessed. But he's still childless. And so God comes to Abram and says, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward." Abraham has to decide if he's going to trust the fear. Is he going to trust the uncertainty of the future, or is he going to step into that uncertainty trusting in God? And then in Joshua 1 and verse 8, God comes to Joshua as he takes over leadership of the people of Israel. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joshua was there every step of the way as he saw Moses trying to lead this rebellious people. And the headaches that were caused for Moses as the people, it was like herding cats. And so now Joshua takes over. The very first thing God tells him, "Don't be afraid, for I am with you." And then in Matthew 17, Jesus is with the apostles. They're on the Mount of Transfiguration. They've just witnessed this unexplainable event where Jesus is transformed somehow into a spiritual reality. He appears with Moses and Elijah, and they're conversing with each other, and the apostles are driven to their knees, and Jesus tells them, "Get up. Don't be afraid. Now, at the end of the New Testament, the church at Smyrna was facing a great time of persecution. This little church with absolutely no power. Jesus tells them, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. And then he kind of describes some of the things that God, some of you are going to be put into prison, some of you are going to die. But then he comes back at the end and says, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as the victor's crown. Now, we see these, trust me, I don't know if there's 365 of those, but we could spend the whole sermon time just going through instances just like those. Do not be afraid. And we see that and we think, well, God's giving a pep talk here. Here's some folks that are in difficult circumstances, and God's like the coach at halftime that comes in and gives the speech to get the troops riled up. This isn't a pep talk, this is a command. When God says, do not be afraid, when we give in to fear, we are breaking a command of God. We have to decide if we really believe the battle belongs to the Lord or not. Do not be afraid. In Scripture, usually, when this is used, well, it has more to do, there's a difference between being absolutely afraid and being anxious or fretting over the future. Fear is a response to stimulants. Sometimes it can be very helpful. You know, if a lion all of a sudden pounced into the auditorium, fight or flight, right? We'll let the elders do the fighting and we'll all take the flight, right? Yeah, that can be helpful, but generally speaking, our fear is not located in one particular threat, but in an unknown future. So it's more like fretting. So when anxiety, worry, fearfulness, fretting over this unnamed future, that's what what we're called to do when God tells us, do not be afraid. Are we going to trust God or are we not going to trust God? Is He Lord of the future or is He not? Is He King of our lives or is He not? We have to decide whether we're going to give in to fear or whether we're going to step out in faith. And there's a lot of fearfulness going on in our country right now. Generally speaking, a lot of the division, a lot of the heartache, a lot of churches that are being split apart, it's because we can't really decide what to do with this angst, this fear about the future. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is giving what we call the limited commission to the apostles. It's called that because he sends them out to preach basically in Galilee to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They're to speak to the Jews. It's kind of a dress rehearsal for what's going to come later in what we call the Great Commission, where he's going to send them to Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. But right now they are just to go to the lost sheep of Israel in Galilee. And it's not going to be easy because this is the first time they're sent out away from Jesus. And so he's warning them that even though this is a limited time and space deal that I'm sending you on, you're going to face opposition. And I'm not going to be there to be the focus of it. Up to this point, Jesus was the focus of all the opposition that had taken place. And so he tells them some things to expect. So in verse 17, be on your guard, you will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. Well, this pep talk is not going so well up to this point. They can expect, they can face some opposition here. And then you will be hated by everyone because of me. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Now, maybe he's looking to the future and preparing them a little bit for their main job when he does send them out on the Great Commission into all the world. But they can expect this opposition to take place even as they go among the Jews in what for some of them was their hometowns. Areas where they were very familiar. They are going to face opposition, and they have to decide if they're going to trust Jesus' promises or they're not. And he mentions 3 times in the verses that follow that they're not to be afraid, and 3 different reasons why they should not be afraid. So do not be afraid of them. For there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. You need to trust in the justice of God. You're going to face opposition. Some people are going to abuse you in ways that are not fair. But trust, nobody's getting away with anything. We need to remember that, right? When our boss uses and abuses us in ways that we think is unfair, when politicians make empty promises, when things are just going to pieces around us, no one is getting by with anything. God sees everything that happens, and everything will be called into account. Also, we need to fear God more than we fear the world around us. So he says in verse 28, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. We need to remember who it is, this God in whom we live and move and have our being. We need to forget, never to forget, that he is the powerful one who controls all things. And we need to be more afraid of displeasing him than we are with the opposition to the world. Moses told the children of Israel in Exodus 20 as they witnessed things that no other generation have witnessed. They saw Mount Sinai shaking at its foundation. They saw the fire and the smoke on the mountain. And then they heard the voice of God speaking from the top of the mountain, the Ten Commandments for all to hear. And they come to Moses after all of that spectacle is over and say, please don't ever let him do that again. You go and talk to him, let him tell you, and then you come back and tell us what he says. But we don't ever want to experience that again. And Moses says, oh no, you had to see that, you had to experience that, so that the fear of the Lord will keep you from sinning. Well, we know that generation didn't work, but they needed to remember who God was, so they would remember who they were, and that the world could not harm them because of this mighty God that they were serving. And finally, they always needed to remember the care of God. Don't be afraid. And he says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them fall to the ground outside our Father's care. And even the hairs of your head are numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. God has the hairs of our head numbered. Now, for some of us, that's getting easier and easier for him to keep track of, but he does. And when a tiny bird falls to the ground, God knows everything. Do we not know that he understands what's going on in our lives? Don't we trust him to take care of us? So don't be afraid. A couple of sea stories to sort of illustrate the fact. Jesus and the apostles are in a boat, and there's a storm. These are professional seamen, and they are terrified. This storm is so bad, it seems to be outstripping their ability to deal with it. They're afraid the ship is going to be swamped and they're going to be lost. And Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat. Remember how this story goes. It shows either how hard he's working or how well he sleeps. But he's sleeping through the whole thing. And they wake him up. And they say, don't you care that we're about to die? So he stands up and rebukes the wind and the waves. First, peace, be still. And then he rebukes the apostles. He said to the disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Their fear caused them not to see who it is that was in the boat along with them. They saw the danger, and of course we can understand that. Because they saw that, they did not see the one that had the power to save. Our faith takes our eyes off of God and off of his promises. In fact, that's even illustrated even better by another sea story with another boat, another storm. This one, Jesus has sent the apostles across the lake, and he's going to spend some time alone praying. And as they're rowing across the lake, they run into a storm. The wind is so strong they can't make any headway. And then Jesus comes walking on the water. And they think it's a ghost. I mean, what would you think if you saw somebody walking across the water? We can give them a pass for being a little bit concerned when they see this. But he calls out, don't be worried, it's me. And Peter says, well, if it is you, let me come walk out to you. Jesus says, come on. And Peter does that. He does fine until he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he sees the wind and the waves. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. See, as long as he saw Jesus, he had faith. The storms wasn't so, but then when he took his eyes off of Jesus and looked at his situation, his fear took over and his faith. In fact, when Jesus rescues him, the first thing Jesus says to him, "O ye of little faith." See, taking his eyes off of Jesus, seeing the surroundings, seeing the storm, caused him to become afraid, and he lost connection with the Lord. A theologian a long, long ago and in a galaxy far, far away said this: fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Oh, right, Star Wars. But I think Yoda's onto something here, don't you? That when we're afraid, that leads to anger. We see that reflected in our world today, don't we? And anger leads us to fracture and split and find people to blame. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Our fear leads us away from Jesus. It leads us to doubt who is really in charge. It makes us see every difference as an existential threat. It polarizes people and makes enemies out of neighbors. Fear platforms the extremes and gives influence to the loudest voice. Fear fuels anger and outrage and distorts our view of reality. Fear keeps us from seeing any value in any view other than our own. Thus, fear makes cooperation and compromise and getting along with other people impossible. We have to decide if we're going to give in to fear or whether we're going to cling to our faith. Either we trust that God is in control, that God is Lord of lords and King of kings, or we don't. Over and over again, as we saw, Jesus tells his disciples, those who would follow him, do not be afraid. It is our fear that keeps us from believing that God is with us despite the storms around us. Fear keeps us hoarding our material possessions rather than being generous and sharing with others. Fear keeps us uncomfortable anytime the church does anything different or goes through a time of transition as we're getting ready to go through. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. We can have faith or we can have fear, but we really can't have both. So, how do we allow our faith to overcome our fear and fret of the future? Well, there's no easy, 5 easy steps, or we already would have mastered that. What we're dealing with is our cognitive decision to trust God versus an emotional response to what seems to be a threat. And so there's always going to be this tug of war. But God gives us His Spirit within us and allows us to trust in Him even when that's not what our first response might be in the flesh. And we have to decide whether or not. So let me just suggest a few things that may help us. And none of these are profound or anything. In fact, the first thing you'll say, well, thanks for that, Captain Obvious. And that is to pray. Anytime you're fearful of what's going to happen in the future, then your first response needs to be prayer. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, in being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. This is, of course, in Gethsemane, when he knows the next day he's going to the cross. And he's been praying He's been praying, among other things, for God to take this away. Find another, this plan had been going on for a while, but if you can find something else now that I'm there to the cross. Was Jesus afraid of dying? Was he fretting what was going to happen the next day? Maybe not exactly in the same way that we would be, but he is in anguish. The Greek word there is agonia, the word from which we get agonize. Jesus was agonizing, and he was driven to his knees in prayer, praying so fervently that sweat was pouring off of him, almost like he was bleeding. He had other people gather with him to pray. Now, they fell asleep. They didn't have the motivation that he had. But so the very first thing, our very first response to fear and foreboding and fretting over the future needs to be prayer. That's not a last resort. I remember hearing a story of a church, back in the old days, we make decisions in a men's business meeting. So they're having this men's business meeting, and there was a great difference of opinion over something to do. They were arguing, voices got louder and louder. There were insults being thrown back and forth. I mean, they were trying to decide what color to paint the auditorium or something. And things were getting out of control. And so one of the elders stood up and said, "Brothers, we need to pause and pray." And one of the other elders goes, "I can't believe it's come to this. Things have finally gotten so bad that we need to pray." No, prayer is not our last resort. Prayer should be our first response. Secondly, we need to remind ourselves that fear and fret don't work. Jesus says in Luke 12, "Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest?" Fear and fret doesn't work. I mean, Jesus is going all Dr. Phil on us here. So how's that working for you? I mean, we get tore up by our anxiety and our worry and our fear over the future, and it doesn't do any good. In fact, it's the opposite of what he says. Not only does fear and stress and worry not add any time to your life, it takes away from your life, doesn't it? We just need to remind ourselves that allowing ourselves to get in a state of fear and fret just doesn't help anything. It doesn't accomplish anything. Years ago, I read a little book by Harold Hazlitt. It's an old book, but he refers to a story, rather a study, that studied the kind of things that we worry about. Now, again, the book is old, so the percentages may be off a little bit, but I think they're probably fairly accurate even to today. Things we worry about, 40% of them never come true. We spend time worrying and waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it never drops. This never comes true, so that's kind of wasted effort. And then 30%, I found this interesting, 30% of the things that we obsess over have things that have already happened. Well, we can't do anything about that. We make a decision, and then we worry whether we made the right decision or not. That's kind of wasted effort, isn't it? But that's where we spend a lot of our time worrying. And then 12% is because of the criticism or disapproval that we experience from other people. We really can't control that at all. And then 10% are over health concerns. And again, we can't really do anything about that. So only 8% of all of the things that we spend time worrying about ever come to pass. So 92% of the time that we spent crippled by fear, fretting, worry, anxiety, just wasted time and space. We need to be able just to turn that over to God, because ultimately we can't do anything about it anyway. And then third, we need to feed our faith, not our fear. In Philippians 4, Paul writes this, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." A lot of the fear that we experience about the future, a lot of the anxiety and angst that exists in our world today is because we make the conscious decision to feed the things that are feeding that fear and worry and angst. Our media platforms function by trying to keep us as engaged in their platform as possible. Whether we're talking about television, cable news, or whether we're talking about social media, the way that works is the longer we stay listening, the more commercials we watch, the more money, whatever platform it is, makes. And so they want to keep us absolutely as engaged as possible. And the way they do that is they try to keep us as fearful and angry as possible. That's what keeps us going, scrolling to the next thing. We're fearful and we're angry about what's going on. And so some guy on the internet's wrong and I've got to fix that, sort of thing. So the way we deal with that, it seems to make sense, is we get out of our echo chambers and we feed our faith instead of our fear. We listen to God, Scripture. We listen and participate in praise and worship times. We spend time in fellowship with brothers and sisters that share this certainty that God is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And we turn off the echo chamber that's feeding our fear. You've probably seen this advertised. It's getting sort of wide circulation. It's a little device, about that big, I think, and it's called the brick. Have you seen this? You buy it, I don't know how much it costs, but probably a few folks that I'm almost tempted to buy one for if they would use it. And what it does is you program it to only allow you to spend 15 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day, whatever you choose, on social media. And once you get past that amount, it bricks your phone. See, because the dopamine hits you get from scrolling just feed. And if what you're looking at is all the news that's making you angry, it just feeds that anger and feeds that fear. And so you buy this extra device that go with your phone to brick your phone to keep you from doing that. It's interesting to me that there's a market for that sort of thing, that we recognize that all of this, pouring bad information into. We need to spend more time thinking about what's lovely, what's admirable, what's excellent, praiseworthy. That's what we need to be spending our time thinking about. And finally, we need to spend time being more connected to people. Paul says in Romans 15, may the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you the same attitude of mind toward each other that Christ Jesus had, so that with one mind and one voice you may glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God made His system revolve around community of believers. That there are no Lone Ranger Christians in the Bible. When Paul and Barnabas and later Paul and Silas, when they go out, they establish faith communities. They don't just convince people that Jesus is Lord. They do that, and then they get them together in churches. Why? Because being in a church is so easy? That's why there's so much in the Bible about how we need to practice patience and forgiveness and all those kinds of things, because we are put together in community. But living faith in a fearful world is too hard on our own, and so we need to spend time and invest ourselves in developing relationships with people that share the same faith that we do, so that we do not give in to fear. Either we believe that God is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, or we don't. Either we believe that He has our future in His hand, or not. We have to decide that. And my prayer is for myself and all of us that we as individuals and as a church will see God and lean into faith and leave the fear of the world behind. May God strengthen us so that we live faithfully in a fearful world. May we always believe that God is bigger than whatever problems we are that's facing, no matter what the storm is that we're in the middle of, that we trust that God is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The song we're getting ready to sing asks the question, whom shall I fear? As we sing this song, our elders will be at the back of the auditorium. If there's something you've been struggling with, if you need something about to be prayed over, then go back and let them know what that is, and they'll be happy to help you. Or if you're ready to begin your life of faith by stepping into the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus by being baptized in water and raised to walk a new life, if you're ready to do that, then let them know, and they'll help you with that as well. This song says, whom shall I fear? And it talks about the God of angel armies is always on our side. The God of angel armies is just a different translation of the expression we're probably more used to, the Lord of hosts. God is the commander of angels. He is the commander of all of heaven's host. And He's the one that's a friend of ours. And He's always by our side. And may we always remember that God is with us. And if God is for us, who can stand against us? Let's stand.